The diplomatic station hummed softly with the sound of advanced machinery and distant conversation, its walls glowing faintly with ambient light. Zyra's translucent skin shimmered as she stepped into the central atrium, her delicate tendrils quivering slightly. The space was far too bright for her liking, every surface gleaming in harsh metallic tones. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, a subconscious gesture her species often made when uneasy. It was her first direct interaction with humans, and she was determined to make a good impression. A towering figure in a beige uniform approached her, its posture relaxed and its expression a puzzling mix of furrows and curves, conveying friendliness. Zyra studied the human carefully, noting the broad shoulders and strangely textured skin. "Zyra, right?" the human asked in a deep but pleasant tone. "Yes," she replied, her translator emitting the word in a neutral hum. "It is a privilege to meet your kind in person." The human grinned, teeth flashing like tiny white stones. "Name's Captain Reed. Welcome aboard. We're honored to host you." He gestured for her to follow, and she hesitated, her tendrils flickering faintly. Then she stepped forward, her movements fluid and cautious. They walked in silence for a few moments before a sharp, rhythmic clicking noise echoed down the corridor. Zyra froze. Her tendrils stiffened, the bioluminescent patterns along her arms shifting from a tranquil green to an alarmed orange. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, that's just Max," Captain Reed said with an easy laugh. Zyra's wide, crystalline eyes darted toward the source of the sound. Something emerged from around the corner, and her entire body tensed. The creature was enormous, its dense fur rippling with each step. A long tongue lolled from its mouth, and its forelegs padded forward with an unsettling confidence. "Monster!" Zyra gasped, taking a step back. Reed blinked, then looked down at the golden retriever trotting toward them, tail wagging enthusiastically. "Monster? You mean Max?" "He's not a monster. He's my dog." Max stopped in front of them, tilting his head as if curious about the shimmering alien before him. His tail swished through the air like a cheerful metronome. Zyra's orange bioluminescence pulsed rapidly, and she took another step back, her tendrils curling protectively in front of her chest. "It has so many teeth," she hissed, her voice rising in pitch. Reed chuckled. "Yeah, but they're for chewing kibble, not aliens." "Relax, Max is friendly." The dog barked, a sharp and unexpected sound that made Zyra emit a startled chirp. The noise echoed down the hallway, and she pressed herself against the wall, trembling. "Please control it," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. Reed crouched and ruffled the fur on Max's head. The dog leaned into the touch, panting happily. "He's harmless," Reed assured her. "Max, sit." To Zyra's astonishment, the creature obeyed, dropping its haunches to the floor with a soft thud. Its large, expressive eyes looked up at Reed with something that almost resembled trust. She stared, her mind racing to reconcile the terror she felt with the serene behavior of the so-called dog. "This, Max," Zyra began cautiously. "Is it a companion? A servant?" "Neither," Reed said, standing again. "He's my friend. We've been through a lot together." Zyra's gaze flicked back to the creature, her tendrils unfurling slightly. "Friend?" she repeated, the word foreign in this context. Reed nodded. "Humans and dogs go way back. We domesticated them thousands of years ago. They're loyal, loving, and great company." Zyra frowned, or at least performed the closest equivalent her facial structure allowed. "Your species willingly associates with predators?" "Well, sure," Reed said, shrugging. "But they're not predators to us. They're protectors, helpers, family." Max whined softly and shuffled closer to Zyra, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air around her. She froze again, unsure whether to flee or stand her ground. Reed noticed her hesitation and reached out a hand. "Here," he said, holding out a small, brown object. "Give him this. It's a treat. He'll like you more if you do." Zyra eyed the treat suspiciously, her bioluminescence flickering faintly. Her translator struggled to interpret the exact meaning of treat, but she grasped enough to understand it was a gift. Carefully, She extended a single tendril toward Reed's hand, the translucent appendage trembling as it grasped the object. Max's tail wagged faster, creating a rhythmic thumping against the floor. He leaned forward, his nose brushing Zyra's hand as he sniffed eagerly. She flinched but held steady, her breath quick and shallow. "Go on," Reed encouraged. With great hesitation, Zyra extended the treat toward Max. The dog's tongue flicked out, warm and wet, as he gently took it from her grasp. Zyra emitted a surprised chirp, her tendrils retracting sharply. But Max merely chewed the treat happily, his tail wagging with unrestrained joy. "He didn't bite me," Zyra said, her voice filled with cautious wonder. "Of course not," Reed said, grinning. "Max wouldn't hurt a fly." Zyra wasn't entirely convinced. Her gaze lingered on the dog as he finished his treat and looked up at her with what seemed to be an expectant expression. His tail wagged slower now, more like a polite request than an overzealous greeting. "Your species is strange," she said finally. "On my world, no one would dare approach such a creature, let alone keep it close." "Well, that's part of why we're out here," Reed said, gesturing around the station. "To learn about each other. You probably think Max is scary now, but give him a chance. He might surprise you." Zyra's gaze flicked from Reed to Max, her bioluminescence gradually shifting back to green. She still felt a deep unease in the dog's presence, but there was also something oddly captivating about its behavior. It was unlike anything she had encountered in her travels. Max barked again, startling her out of her thoughts, but this time she didn't retreat. Instead, she stood still, watching as the dog rose to its feet and wagged its tail, its energy undiminished. "I will observe," she said carefully. But from a distance, Reed laughed, clapping her lightly on the shoulder. "Fair enough. Just wait. You'll warm up to him." As they continued down the corridor, Max trotting cheerfully beside Reed, Zyra trailed behind, her wide eyes fixed on the dog. She still couldn't shake the primal fear bubbling beneath her surface, but curiosity had begun to creep in, softening the edges of her apprehension. The station doors opened to a wider area, and Zyra realized this encounter was far from over. Max turned his head toward her and barked again, his tail wagging even faster, as if to say, "This is just the beginning." Max trotted confidently through the open atrium, his tail wagging with every step. Zyra lingered several paces behind, her shimmering tendrils twitching as she observed the creature with a mixture of apprehension and intrigue. The human, Captain Reed, walked beside Max, occasionally tossing the dog a small object. A ball, Zyra realized after a moment. Each time the object bounced across the floor, Max would bound after it with astonishing speed, his movements a blur of energy and purpose. "What is he doing?" Zyra asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and skepticism. "He's playing," Reed replied, his tone casual, as if it were the most natural explanation in the universe. "Playing," Zyra repeated slowly, her translator struggling to match the concept to anything familiar. "Is this an important task for your kind?" Reed chuckled. "Not exactly. It's more like recreation. It makes him happy. Gives him exercise. Strengthens our bond." Zyra tilted her head, her tendrils rippling in thought. On her world, energy was conserved with great care. Frivolous exertion was unheard of. Watching the dog chase the ball, she found it difficult to believe this activity served any purpose at all. Yet there was something captivating about Max's exuberance, the unrestrained joy in the way he dashed after the object, his tail wagging furiously when he returned it to Reed. The human knelt to pat Max on the head. "Good boy," he said warmly. Zyra flinched at the sudden movement, her tendrils curling tightly against her body. She watched as Max leaned into the touch, his eyes half closing in apparent contentment. It was a behavior she couldn't fully comprehend. Predators in her experience were solitary, calculating, and ruthless. Yet here was this creature, gleefully surrendering itself to physical contact, showing no signs of aggression or dominance. Reed glanced back at her and smiled. "You want to try?" She recoiled instinctively, her bioluminescence flashing an anxious yellow. "I do not think that would be wise." "Come on," Reed encouraged. You saw how gentle he is? I'll show you what to do. Zyra hesitated, her tendrils quivering as she considered his offer. The thought of touching the creature made her stomach churn, but a deeper, quieter part of her was curious. This encounter was unlike anything she had prepared for. Wasn't the purpose of her mission to bridge understanding between their species? I will attempt, she said finally, her voice reluctant. Reed beamed. Great. Just kneel down like this. Awkwardly, Zyra mimicked his posture, lowering herself onto her jointed limbs. Her tendrils swayed uncertainly as Max approached, his tongue lolling and his tail wagging with a steady rhythm. He sniffed at her, his wet nose brushing against the smooth, translucent surface of her arm. She froze, every nerve in her body screaming at her to retreat. Relax, Reed said gently. He's just saying hello. Max stepped closer, his nose twitching as he took in her unfamiliar scent. Zyra's tendrils curled inward, but she forced herself to remain still. The creature didn't seem hostile, but his proximity sent a wave of unease coursing through her. Reed reached out and placed his hand on Max's back. Now just do this. Nice and slow. Zyra extended a single tendril, trembling as she brought it closer to the dog's fur. The texture was unlike anything she had ever encountered, soft yet coarse, warm and pulsing with life. She barely brushed against him before pulling back, her bioluminescence flickering in confusion. That's a start, Reed said, his tone encouraging. Max, seemingly oblivious to her hesitation, turned and nudged her arm with his nose. Zyra flinched, emitting a startled chirp, but the dog merely wagged his tail, his eyes shining with curiosity. He sat back on his haunches and tilted his head, as if waiting for her next move. Zyra stared at him, her tendrils fluttering with uncertainty. He expects something? Yeah, Reed said with a laugh. He likes attention. Try petting him again. He's pretty patient. Her second attempt was more deliberate. She extended 2 tendrils this time, running them cautiously along Max's back. The sensation was strange, but not unpleasant, and she marveled at the way the dog leaned into her touch, his eyes closing in contentment. He seems pleased, she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Told you, Reed replied. Dogs are all about love and trust. Once they know you're a friend, they'll stick by you no matter what. Zyra's tendrils stilled as she processed his words. Love and trust. These were not concepts her species associated with creatures of this size or disposition. On her world, survival depended on vigilance and caution. Bonds of this nature were inconceivable. Yet here was this human, casually claiming a predator as a friend, and the predator reciprocated with unguarded affection. Max rolled onto his back, exposing his belly, and Zyra recoiled slightly. What is he doing now? She asked, her voice tinged with alarm. That's a good thing, Reed explained. It means he trusts you. Go ahead, rub his belly. Zyra hesitated, her tendrils curling in uncertainty. But Max remained still, his tail thumping against the floor in a steady rhythm. Slowly, she reached out, brushing her tendrils across his exposed stomach. The dog's leg twitched in response, and she pulled back sharply. Is he injured? She asked, alarmed. Reed burst out laughing. No, that's just a reflex. He likes it. She tried again, this time with more confidence. Max let out a contented huff and closed his eyes, his entire body relaxed. Zyra's bioluminescence shifted to a soft green, the color of cautious curiosity. This is unexpected, she admitted. That's dogs for you, Reed said, leaning back on his heels. They teach you a lot about trust, even when you don't expect it. Zyra's tendrils stilled as she watched the dog, her thoughts swirling. Max was unlike any creature she had ever encountered, and his behavior challenged everything she thought she knew about predators. There was no calculation in his actions, no hidden malice, only an open, unguarded joy that seemed entirely foreign to her. For the first time, she wondered what her species might have lost by avoiding such bonds. Max rolled back onto his feet and barked, his tail wagging as he nudged the ball toward her. She glanced at Reed, who nodded encouragingly. Picking up the ball with a tendril, She hesitated only a moment before tossing it gently across the room. Max bolted after it, his movements fluid and full of purpose. When he returned, the ball held firmly in his mouth. Zyra felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Not fear, not confusion, something warmer. Reed grinned. See? He's already warming up to you. Zyra looked at the dog, her tendrils shifting to a soft, steady green. Perhaps, she said softly, I'm warming up to him as well. As Max barked again, her apprehension began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of curiosity. Whatever this creature was, he was far more than she had imagined, and she suspected there was much more to learn. Zyra sat cross-legged on the smooth floor of the atrium, her tendrils unfurled and relaxed. Max lay beside her, his head resting on his paws as he panted softly, his tail thumping intermittently against the floor. The initial tension that had filled the air earlier was gone, replaced by an odd sense of companionship. Zyra's bioluminescence glowed faintly green, an unspoken acknowledgement of her newfound comfort. Captain Reed watched them from a few steps away, arms crossed and a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. You've come a long way since calling him a monster, he remarked, his voice light but tinged with pride. Zyra tilted her head toward Reed, her translucent skin shimmering under the station's ambient light. It was not an entirely baseless conclusion, she replied. In my experience, creatures with sharp teeth and unrestrained energy are typically hazardous. Reed chuckled, crouching down to join them. That's fair, he admitted. But Max is different. Dogs like him are all about loyalty and affection. They just want to be part of your pack. Pack, Zyra repeated, tasting the unfamiliar word through her translator. Her tendrils flickered briefly as she processed its meaning. In my culture, the concept of a pack is one of survival, a necessity born of mutual reliance and protection. Your bond with this creature, it seems to extend beyond survival. Reed nodded, scratching Max behind the ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes closing with satisfaction. It's not just about surviving, he said. It's about thriving. Having a dog like Max around makes life better. He's family. Family. The translator rendered the word in Zyra's native language as a complex amalgamation of duty, kinship, and warmth. It resonated with her, yet it felt strange when applied to a creature like Max. Max lifted his head and nudged her arm with his nose, his tail wagging again. Zyra hesitated, then extended a tendril to gently stroke his fur. The dog's response, a soft, contented huff, sent a ripple of something unfamiliar through her. Connection. I cannot deny his capacity to evoke trust, she said slowly, though I find it puzzling. On my world, such emotions are not freely offered. That's what makes it special, Reed replied. Dogs don't care where you're from or what you look like. They just want to love and be loved. The simplicity of the statement struck Zyra. Her species valued precision and caution, emotions filtered through layers of analysis and logic. To offer something as profound as love without preconditions seemed reckless, even dangerous. Yet here was Max, a creature who embodied that principle without hesitation, and she could not deny the magnetic pull of his presence. As if sensing the shift in her thoughts, Max picked up his ball and dropped it at her feet, looking up at her expectantly. His tail wagged with unspoken encouragement. Zyra stared at the ball, then at Max, her tendrils curling slightly in uncertainty. He wants you to play, Reed explained, his tone gentle. Zyra picked up the ball with two tendrils, its texture alien and slightly rough against her skin. She turned it over, examining the strange object before looking back at Max. The dog's tail wagged faster, his entire body vibrating with anticipation. With a small flick of her tendrils, she sent the ball rolling across the room. Max bolted after it, his movements fluid and purposeful. Watching him, Zyra felt an unexpected pang of something she couldn't immediately name. Not fear, not confusion, something warmer. When Max returned, the ball clutched triumphantly in his mouth. She couldn't help the faint ripple of amusement that passed through her. Her bioluminescence shifted to a brighter green, a color her people rarely displayed outside moments of profound curiosity or tentative joy. Reed grinned. See? He's not so bad, huh? He is tolerable, Zyra said, though her tone lacked the edge it once carried. She glanced down at Max, who had settled comfortably beside her again, his eyes filled with unguarded affection, perhaps even agreeable. Reed laughed. That's the spirit. Zyra leaned back, her tendrils swaying gently as she considered the day's events. Max's presence had challenged her in ways she hadn't anticipated, forcing her to confront deeply ingrained fears and assumptions. In her world, creatures like him were symbols of danger, their unpredictability a constant threat. Yet here, in the presence of this human and his so-called monster, she had experienced something entirely different. Your bond with him, she said after a moment, it is not merely functional. It is symbiotic. Exactly, Reed agreed. We take care of each other. Zyra turned her gaze back to Max. The dog's steady breathing, his relaxed posture, the warmth in his eyes. All of it painted a picture of trust so complete it felt almost otherworldly. She reached out with a tendril, letting it rest lightly on his back. Max wagged his tail once, a small but unmistakable sign of approval. Perhaps, she said quietly, there is merit in such a bond. On my world, fear governs much of our interaction with the natural world. But here, I see that there is another way. Reed smiled, his expression softening. You're starting to get it? For a moment, the three of them sat in comfortable silence. The station's ambient hum filled the space, a gentle reminder of the vastness of the universe surrounding them. Zyra's mind raced with possibilities, her perspective shifting in ways she couldn't fully articulate. When she finally stood, Max rose with her, his tail wagging as he looked up at her expectantly. Reed followed, his hands resting casually on his hips. I must share this experience with my people, Zyra said, her voice steady. They may not understand at first, but perhaps, with time, they will see the value in what you have shown me. Reed nodded. That's what this whole mission is about. Understanding each other. Max barked, breaking the quiet, and Zyra's bioluminescence flickered with a faint glow of amusement. I will remember him, she said, meeting Reed's gaze. Max, the monster who is not a monster at all. Reed laughed. He has that effect on people. As they parted ways, Max bounded forward, his energy undiminished, and barked one last time in farewell. Zyra paused, glancing back at the dog, her tendrils swaying in a gesture of acknowledgement. Perhaps trust, she thought, was not as fragile as her people believed. Perhaps it was something that could bridge even the vastest of differences. As she turned to leave, her bioluminescence glowed softly, a quiet testament to the transformation she had begun.